So we currently have 3 fusion prototypes in our lab here in Seattle. Each of them is focused on a different aspect of the science. And then we've got 3 additional test cells that are focused on our ion beam, our diagnostic development, our high voltage development. And so that allows us to very quickly iterate independently and then bring things together as they get better and better. And I think that's one of the really powers of what we're doing here at Avalanche is that quick iteration time. We've had, we've been building devices for a little over 2 years now. And in that time, we've iterated on the device 64 major iterations on the device. And that's just very snappy and allows us to continue to tune where we're going.
Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm your host, Karan Takar. Today's guest is Kate Kelly, Chief of Staff at Avalanche Fusion. We start with an overview of nuclear fusion's potential to transform global energy, then dive into the company's recent breakthroughs and their innovative test, fail, fix approach. Kate discusses the challenges commercializing fusion, funding hurdles, and evolving public perceptions of nuclear technology. She also shares resources for learning about fusion, her vision for its future impact, and what excites her most about Avalanche's journey. Check the show notes for more and enjoy this inspiring conversation with Kate Kelly. Hello, Kate. It is so wonderful to have you on the podcast. As I was just mentioning, you're one of the first people on the podcast who work in the nuclear fusion industry. And many guests that I've had on have mentioned fusion as an area that they're particularly excited about. So I can't wait to dive into everything fusion. I also, just to preface this conversation, do not have a lot of technical understanding about how fusion works, like where things stand today. So as a result, I'm even more excited to be able to learn from you. And to kick things off, can you please just give a brief overview of nuclear fusion and why it's considered to be a potential game changer for global energy systems?
Sure. Karan, thank you so much for having me on the pod. I'm excited to be here. So maybe we should start with just Fusion 101 really quickly, right? So fusion is when you take 2 small particles and you smash them together so that they form new particles and release energy. This is sort of the opposite of nuclear fission, where you have a large isotope and it is unstable and it decays into different isotopes, different elements, and it releases energy as those bonds are broken, as it's decaying. We were talking earlier that one of the reasons the word nuclear is used as it pertains to both fusion and fission is because we're talking about the type of energy that is being released, right? When you burn coal, it's a chemical reaction that's what's happening when you're breaking the bonds. In fission and fusion, the energy is coming from the nuclear connection between particles. And so that's where the energy is coming from. So fusion's a really interesting space to be in right now. There's a lot of things that have been changing and evolving in the last decade that are why you're seeing so much energy in the space. So one of the first things that I think has happened in the industry is that the access to high performance computing has really just exploded, and that makes it a lot easier and it makes it a lot more possible to explore the really complex math that is necessary for us to figure out how to make fusion happen. So access to that high performance computing. Along with that, a lot of the national labs have open sourced these different types of codes that you can use to simulate physics. And that is used by a lot of the fusion companies to simulate their particular devices. So access to that open source code, access to high performance computing allows us to just explore a whole variety of different approaches to fusion. So that's one of the things that I think's really happened in the industry in the last decade. The next thing that's happened is we're seeing some new materials, or sorry, some new manufacturing make things like high temperature superconducting magnets a reality, and that allows us to make magnets that are much higher power, much smaller. And that's really important for a lot of the fusion companies who are using magnets in their devices. And then one of the third things that I think is happening is we're seeing a lot of things in the market influence the need for fusion, right? Fusion. So you're seeing a lot of impact investors who are going, "Hey, I want to go work on things that are going to improve our energy resilience or going to support combating climate change." I think you're seeing this regulatory drive to electrification really push the demand for more energy, which is the whole, I think really at the core of the desire for fusion. And then AI is also just continuing to push on that. And then I think one of the other trends that we're seeing is we're seeing this kind of return to deep tech investments, right? With things like SpaceX, with this SpaceX really demonstrated the ability to take something that was once very firmly in the realm of government, which was space, and turn it into a commercial operation. You see that with Blue Origin as well. And I think that says to the market, hey, these things, these big, hard, extremely technical, and oftentimes expensive projects can become commercial ventures. And I think that makes things like fusion sort of interesting, right? How do we go after these big, hard problems? Did that answer the question?
Yes, it did. Thank you for providing that overview, and definitely have a few follow-ups. You mentioned Blue Origin. I saw that Avalanche's co-founders both previously worked at Blue Origin, which in an interview that I was reading that they conducted, they mentioned how just similarly, like how you mentioned, the space industry has this model where it's test, fail, fix, because you're attacking such a large problem. You're investing significant amounts of money into these products. And in order to ultimately get to the end result, as they said it, or my interpretation of what they said, the way to go about it is you continually iterate and learn, and then iterate again and learn until you hopefully ultimately create this transformative solution, which nuclear fusion technology has the potential to be. And in this article from Canary Media that I was reading, it said that for fusion to ultimately work, hydrogen must be converted into plasma. And again, remember, I'm not an engineer. And that transformation, which I found to be super interesting, that transformation from of converting hydrogen into plasma requires million degree temperatures, much hotter than the core of the sun.
So in fusion, what we're all trying to do essentially is put as much of our fuel into conditions that make it very, very likely that you're going to see fusion occur for as long as possible and as much of it as we can. So this is something called it's called the triple product. So you want to put your fuel into conditions where it has enough energy to fuse. For some fusion companies, that's represented as heat. For some, it's the speed at which it's moving, the energy. You want to keep it in these conditions for as long as possible. This is called confinement time. And then you want as much of your fuel in there. You want it packed as densely as possible. And so that's density. And this is called the triple product. And so what all of us are trying to do at the end of the day is via our unique approaches, push those metrics as hard as we can so that we've got these plasmas that where fusion is occurring. So so a lot of the fusion companies are really targeting these very, very high temperatures. We're doing something a little different. We're using voltages to get our particles orbiting in our device very quickly.
Yeah, I think the article was actually alluding to that, where the team at Avalanche is targeting a voltage of 300
Kil-
kilovolts,
yeah,
sorry,
kilovolts.
to get
Yep.
to the optimum fusion energy. And it has hit, but this might be a little outdated. But at the time that this article was written, which is, I think, April 2023, the team hit 200
Mhm.
kilovolts, which is a big deal. Is that similarly where the team stands today on that metric?
I think the last count we were at 248 kilovolts. So we're continuing to push. That's one of our metrics that we're continuing to push. Another metric that's really important for our setup is the amount of beam current. So that's the amount of our fuel that we're putting into the device. We measure that in amps. So we just got to a milliamp, which is an important KPI for us as well. So there's a number of these different um, metrics on the device that we keep track of. And you alluded to this earlier when you were talking about that like kind of that test design, iterate, learn cycle that's really at the core of what we're doing at Avalanche because our device is small, right? It's the size of, something that could sit on a kitchen table because it's small. It allows us to iterate very, very quickly. Like we will conceive of an experiment. We'll start the experiment at the beginning of the week. We'll get results. We'll determine maybe we need to tweak something, maybe we need to machine a new part, maybe we've learned something, and we can do that and have a new experiment ready to go the following week. It's something that we can do in days many times. And what that allows us to do is have multiple of these devices that can push on each of our core KPIs independently. So we currently have 3 Fusion prototypes in our lab here in Seattle. Each of them is focused on a different aspect of the science. And then we've got 3 additional test cells that are focused on our ion beam, our diagnostic development, our high voltage development. And so that allows us to very quickly iterate independently and then bring things together as they get better and better. And I think that's one of the really powers of what we're doing here at Avalanche is that quick iteration time. We've been building devices for a little bit, a little over 2 years now. And in that time, we've iterated on the device 64 major iterations on the device. And that's just like, very snappy and allows us to continue to tune where we're going.
That's amazing. It's a lot of iterations,
It is.
which, yeah, I feel like is super important. So, as I'm understanding it, on one hand, there are a lot of these technological metrics that need to be hit in order to make fusion technology actually work. And then separately, there's also the commercial viability angle. So, I'm curious to see how the team thinks about like balancing the two. Is the orientation currently focused more so on making the technology work? And then once those technological metrics are effectively achieved, then the focus will be on figuring out how to scale that technology to drive down the costs to a way that the costs are competitive with other technologies. Is that a fair way to frame it, or am I completely misrepresenting how fusion actually translates in the real world?
I mean, I can't speak for everyone, right? I mean, I think we really think about these two things going hand in hand, right? Um, when the company was founded, one of the reasons that Brian and Robin decided to focus on small was partially because, coming from a space background, they were thinking about if you want to continue to expand what we can do in space, you need an appropriate power source that is of the right sort of form factor. So they were thinking about like a customer point of view there. Um, but also if you don't kind of deeply understand what markets you're going after and who the end user is going to be, you're unlikely to build the right thing for those customers, right? So we do a lot. We have a few folks at the company who do spend their time focused on what are the unique applications that mobile fusion can go after, where are places where the types of capabilities that a small fusion machine would provide, like the long duration of the power, not needing to refuel for months or years, and being able to run continuously. Where are there markets that would really benefit from those sorts of capabilities? And then what do they need, right? How do you think about what would that device need to look like? What size would it need to be? Like understanding that helps us start to understand what are some of the future constraints we would have on productionizing these sorts of devices. I think the other thing that was really top of mind when the company was founded, in addition to this idea of like how do you support space as an industry, was also how do you make these things economical, right? So mass manufacturing as a venue for delivering fusion power felt really powerful, like but power. Um, if you think about one of the challenges that the fission industry has had, it's that each power plant is bespoke to some extent. I was reading something that said that I think the majority of the fission power plants in the United States, with maybe the exception of the two that have just been built in Georgia, are all unique in their design, which means that you need to get recertified every time you do one of these things, as opposed to if I'm creating them off of an assembly line and there's consistency in the design and behavior, that simplifies your regulatory world and it simplifies for customers what to expect, and it brings down your cost curve because you're not bespoke manufacturing every device. So that's something else that we think about a lot, is mass manufacturability of what we're doing.
Got it. And what are the current major barriers to commercializing nuclear fusion? I know we've talked about some of the key metrics on the technology front that the team is attempting to hit. But outside of those technology metrics, are there any like key barriers that are currently hindering the commercialization of fusion? And how close are we to seeing fusion to ultimately be commercialized in your estimate, if you can provide a sense on that front?
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Fusion Industry Association. It is our trade association. Most of the fusion, I think there's 45 fusion companies globally. Most of us participate in the FIA. They put out an annual sort of state of the market report. The most recent one just came out this summer, and they do an excellent job of surveying fusion companies about what do they see as the timelines for fusion being available broadly. And so most of us say like early 2030s timeframe. Um, I mean, I think when you think about what are barriers to commercialization, I think they're I think the barriers to commercialization for fusion are very similar to the barriers for commercialization for any of the hard tech that's coming out of climate tech and whatnot, right? You need your customers, you need a working product, you need to get through that first demonstration, and you need to scale, right? These it was actually on a deep tech panel at New York Climate Week that Capgemini ran, and there was a lady who worked on it's like gas osmosis for industrial applications. There was a lady who works on hardware software for microgrids that have a heavy renewable component. So lots of uh, needing lots of flexibility for increased output versus it's dark, the solar panels aren't collecting energy. And then a lady from MIT's The Engine Venture. And so we were all talking about this, like, yeah, this path to scaling commercially. And it was interesting to me that everyone had the same answer. We all had the same answer. It was not what was a scaling challenge for fusion was going to be unique to fusion. We were all the same. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
So, as a follow up to that, given the high costs associated with nuclear fusion research, how is Avalanche Fusion navigating funding and investment challenges?
one of the things that I think is really critical for any startup is you want great partners as investors, right? And that's what we're looking for. We've been very lucky with the Azola Prime Impact Fund, with Lower Carbon, with Founders Fund, with Congruent, with Autodesk, with Toyota Ventures. All of these folks have been incredible partners, in that they give us great feedback. They have really helped us with honing, thinking about that target market fit, with thinking through, what lessons they've learned from their time in venture that they think would help us. So we're really, um, when we think about funding strategies, when we think about, you know, how we continue to develop the company, it's really about finding those great partnerships. That's critical to us, and we're always looking for great new partners.
That makes a lot of sense. Um, in shifting gears slightly, of course, within the nuclear space more broadly, there has been a misperception or a hesitation in some sense from the public to really get behind technologies that might fall under the nuclear umbrella. And that's definitely shifting in recent times. However, would love to just get a sense of your thoughts on why you think people, on one hand, might be not super enthusiastic about a technology that falls under the nuclear umbrella. And then on the other hand, there is a lot of enthusiasm for fusion these days, as we're seeing by some of the massive deals that have been occurring in the space over the past few years. So would love to also get your take on what you think is driving that.
Yeah. So first, I think fusion has occupied such an interesting space from a like science fiction, pop culture mindset for a really long time. You know, the arc reactor in Iron Man is a fusion reactor, right? And the
Oh,
line, what is
really?
it? Yeah, yeah, and it's like
Cool.
Tony Stark made this in a cave, right? And it's like, yeah, that'd be great.
Well, sometimes I actually have a question that I lead with asking if your company was to be a superhero, which superhero would you choose? I kind of wish I started this one with that because Iron Man is
I
mostly
don't know.
my
I
favorite.
don't know exactly who I would have answered, but yeah. So I mean, like the arc reactor is a fusion reactor, right? If you've watched The Expanse or read the Expanse book series, the energy source driving the drive that they use in all of their spaceships is fusion, right? So
Wow.
fusion is very much in like kind of the pop culture science fiction mindset. It has been for a long time. I think that the so I'm gonna like detour for a hot second here. So one of the things that I read a long time ago that I thought was very interesting was this essay on kind of the different climate like group mindsets that exist, right? And they talked about this idea of like the energy maximalist, someone who believes that access to clean, abundant, inexpensive energy will actually solve a lot of societal problems. And I absolutely fall into that bucket of people. I believe that access like that unlocks a lot of opportunities for communities, but also for invention, right? If you don't have to like think hard about how much energy you're using, what does that unlock for us? Um, and the reason I bring that up is because I think that that also is part of this like imagination that goes along with the excitement about fusion is people can sort of connect that idea of fusion unlocks all of these innovative opportunities. And so I think that's one of the reasons people get excited. I think that, as you said earlier, alluded to, and I think there's good data that shows this, public perception around vision is also massively shifting. I think as people start to go, I want clean, abundant energy, right? And The next 10 years, I think for us as a planet is really about solar, wind, geothermal, fission, wave power, right? Getting these established um, clean energy sources available and abundant as much as possible. And we need to be getting fusion ready to come join that group over the next few decades because as we electrify everything, that demand for power is only going to grow, right? We need to be ensuring that access to all of this energy is very available. The other thing I'll say here is I was listening to this other podcast a few months ago maybe, and they were talking about desalinization. And the thing that this person said, and I'll find the link for you because I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he made this comment that resonated with me so strongly. He said, the 20th century was about large centralized infrastructure projects, right? Our grid, the grid that the US, Canada have, came about in the 20th century. The interstates came about in the 20th century. There was just this huge emphasis on really big infrastructure projects in the 20th century. And he said the 21st century is about decentralized. It is about hyper-local. It is about having the resources and the supplies and the expertise that you need to have your community grow and thrive locally. Right. And he was talking about how expensive it is to pump water around because water is very heavy. And I was like, oh, this resonates so strongly with me. And I think very much aligns with what Avalanche is trying to do of like small scale, but right sized for the community that needs that power. And what does that unlock for that community so that if that community needs to be resilient, everything's there. They're not reliant on some group 100 miles away to be doing something. And so I think that that's another thing that I think people are starting to get. Like, I don't know that people are necessarily verbalizing this, but I think you can start to I feel that energy sometimes when I talk to people about where we go from here when it comes to resources and how we build communities going forward.
I love that. And one of my inspirations for getting involved in the climate and clean energy space, which I don't think I've shared before, I might have, happens to be the fact that, like you mentioned, the decentralized technology aspect that comes from a lot of these newer, cleaner technologies, like solar, for example. I was installing solar panels in a rural village in a developing country, and I was like struck by not only the fact that the costs were becoming affordable for these very low income communities, but also that you could literally drive like hundreds of miles from the nearest city and put energy sources for them to like be able to live off of and get light from, and also develop other productive use appliances around. And yeah, I think fusion, just hearing you talk, and I've been getting excited as this conversation has been going on because unlike solar, fusion seems like it's not an intermittent source of energy where it can instead be turned on and provide energy around the clock
Yeah,
at
yeah,
a miniature scale level,
right.
which
Yeah,
is
exactly.
implications.
Well, and your story about the solar panels, like the other thing that I think is beautiful about that is they didn't have to install hundreds of miles of power line for that, right? Like
Yes.
that additional infrastructure lift was not there.
Mhm.
And I think that's going to be really important globally, right? The idea of the grid is very specific to specific geographies. There are not grids in other places because they either don't make sense or they haven't gotten there yet.
So 10 years from now, how do you envision fusion impacting the global energy market?
I mean, I think that, as we talked about earlier, the FIA's data really says that most of the fusion companies see fusion power on the grid in the 2030s, right? So that'll be a time period of really scaling up, right? And for us, where we want to mass manufacture, it's going to be going through that life cycle of mass manufacturing, right? You start small and you scale and ramp over time, and you get better and better at it. And so, we really think some of our first markets are going to be in those mobile, hard to decarbonize, places where you're looking for unique capabilities. So, anything oceans and maritime is very interesting, we think, for our applications, where you've got a lot of these, you've got all these boats and ships that are running two-stroke motors or are running, these big engines. Those need to be decarbonized and electrified at some point. You've got remote sensing platforms um, for for understanding what's happening in our oceans. And then you've got just remote applications, places where the grid doesn't make sense. So a while ago, we actually had someone reach out and ask if we were selling our product yet, because they had a off-grid, I believe it was an orchid farm. And they were like, I use a diesel generator right now, and I'd really rather not use a diesel generator to power this. And I'm like, and it's like, that's exactly the sort of, unique application that we think we can be starting to answer for folks.
Makes a lot of sense. And in terms of how to think about fusion, the way I'm kind of thinking about it right now is it's sort of like solar plus storage, except at the same capacity factors or at a much higher capacity factor where it can provide or it can use less, ultimately at its most optimal point, can use less energy to create more energy than solar plus storage. Is that a reasonable way to analogy here? Or like how else might you think about it?
Well, let's step back. Let's step back a moment, right? So we sort of the Fusion 101 topic is covers a lot of bases, and I probably only covered a few of them. So let's go back to one of them. So when you talk to Fusion folks, one of the things you'll hear us regularly talking about is this idea of Q greater than one. So what Q greater than one is Q is the ratio of power we put into the device to keep it running under these optimal situations to power we get out of the device. And so you want more power out than you're putting in. And so we think a lot about those Q factors because as you can increase your Q factor, right, from 1 to 2, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, that means you're getting that much more energy out of your device than what you're putting in the first place, right? And so that's going to be, I think, a much like any other technology, there's going to be an R&D curve there to continue to make your devices more effective, more efficient.
What are like some of the specifics that you would expect or hope for someone to know? If you could just provide like a few different topic areas that you think would be helpful for people to dive into in order to equip themselves with that basic scientific literacy.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of great Fusion 101 videos up on YouTube and on the internet, right? Those are great places to start. But you'll very quickly hear a bunch of terms where you're like, I vaguely remember that from a high school science class. And it's like, go Wikipedia that. That's great, right? It took like when I joined, I remember coming to like my first day at the office, and it was like someone said the word isotope, and I was like, I remember this word. I remember this word from high school, but I
Don't
haven't
ask me
used
to
it. I haven't,
explain what that means, please.
pardon?
Don't ask me to explain what that means, please.
No. This is homework for people listening to the podcast. If they're like, I don't remember what an isotope is, Wikipedia's got a great article on what an isotope is, right? It's a great place to start. But you like when I say scientific literacy, what I mean is that you need to be comfortable going and doing some pre-reading on your own, right? Like I think that one of the things I think is really important is demonstrating that you're willing to go get started. You don't need to deeply understand every single thing you read. But coming with informed questions is a great way to get started.
Are there any specific topics that you think one can look into and just get like a high level understanding of? in order to be effective in a role with Avalanche or in the fusion industry more broadly?
So again, the Fusion Industry Association has a lot of great resources on their website. There's a website, another website I'll send it to you separately that's run by volunteers that also has a number of great resources. I think there's starting to be a kind of a broader set of resources for people who are interested in getting into fusion, as well as a deeper set of resources if there's a specific expertise that you have and that you want to continue to develop. Um, in May, the National Science Foundation sponsored a conference on fusion workforce development. They just actually released I was lucky enough to attend that virtually and participate in some of the research that happened there. They just released the white paper that um, goes into what was gleaned from that conference, and one of the things that we talk a lot about in that paper is more resources for folks who are interested to get into the area. So that's a recognized need, and I think people are growing that. We actually have, this will probably be after this podcast gets posted, but every year the Clean Tech Alliance hosts Seattle Fusion Week. So Seattle Fusion Week's next week. Um, which is the October 21st, 22nd, 23rd. It happens every year. But this year we added a day that is specifically focused on educators, students, and policymakers. And we've got a panel on how to bring fusion into your classroom. We've got a panel on how to skills for getting into the fusion workforce. So we're starting to, I think, see more content like that to help people who are interested in the area.
That's really awesome to hear. And we'll be linking the links that you sent to me in the show notes, as well as to the industry association that you mentioned. So, wrapping up now, what excites you the most about Avalanche, where you are now, and where you're hoping to go?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that excites me about Avalanche is the team we've built. I think the team here is incredible. It is everyone comes from a very diverse background. We've got folks who have worked in aerospace. We've got folks who have worked in fusion. We've got folks who have worked in plasmas and folks who are fresh out of school, folks who've worked in software. We've got all sorts of folks. And that diversity of thought, I think, really makes for really interesting team conversations. It makes for a really dynamic atmosphere. And we spend a lot of time thinking about culture because at the end of the day, culture eats strategy, right? If you don't have a great culture, it's really hard to execute. So I really am thankful for the team we've built and the team we're going to continue to build here. Um, Second thing is I still think that fast iterative cycle has got a lot of power behind it because it means that we can try many, many different things on an ongoing basis. And so if something really isn't working, and step back and go, what if we take a left turn here? Right. And the team is set up for having those sorts of conversations. The other thing that like personally I really like to geek out on is I love it when we turn on a new diagnostic. Diagnostics are the key to really understanding what's happening inside the device. And every time we turn on a new diagnostic, we get new insight into what is going on that just helps us continue to tune. The other thing I love geeking out on, sorry, I need one more plug. So I spent a large number of years in software and kind of jumped around in a variety of different roles. And I think that what's happening with high performance computing and all of these new ML models, is really unlocking the ability to look at data in a unique and interesting way. And so our Theory and Sims team does a lot of simulations on cloud compute, and it just I think it's just unlocking this really interesting way to go rapidly on the sim side and think about it from a compute side, and then also like how that intersects with the experimental results just gives us a much more holistic picture. So
And on the machine learning side, so for some reason, when I hear the word machine learning, artificial intelligence also pops up into my mind. Are there any
I like
like
this.
interesting AI applications that you could foresee helping to develop fusion technology?
One of our scientists just had a paper published where he applied ML to some of the results he was seeing from high voltage experiments he was running. So the paper's called, and I can link to it too, it's called a data-driven model for the field emissions from broad area electrodes. Like very, very deep. But like he just came up with this idea where he's like, I've got all this data about stuff that's happening in this high voltage test cell, and I'm going to go find some machine learning application. I'm going to go find some ML and see what sort of model I can build. And he built a model. And like I love that he got curious about this and just went and did it. I'm love that it worked. I love that they published this paper because I think it starts to show that there's a lot of applications that are that when you can apply the correct expertise to can open new horizons.
It's amazing. Yeah, so exciting to see where that goes. And finally, thank you for an incredible conversation. To wrap things up, is there any piece of advice that you would give to young scientists or engineers who are eager to contribute to the field of fusion?
Problem is picking one. Like there I I wish someone had told me when I was just coming out of school how how much of like startups, hard problems, what have you, is I think really comes down to attitude, right? So the first is like having grit, having determination that you can just keep working the problem. The second is everything. Everything is we sort of touched on this a little earlier. Like our world is so complicated at this point. So many systems are interconnected. The complexity of how we live today is no one person can keep in their head, right? And so the problems all feel enormous. And I think one of the big tricks to any sort of complex problem is just keep breaking it down into smaller problems, right? It's okay that you don't necessarily know what step 4, 5, and 6 are, but if you can sort of go, I think I know what steps 1, 2, and 3 are, and I'm going to work on those, 4, 5, and 6 will start to become obvious. And I think just that attitude, that grit, that breaking problems into smaller problems and working through them is a piece of advice I'd give to anyone, but especially people who are thinking about fusion or thinking about working on hard problems.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kate, for taking the time to participate in the interview and for sticking through my less than basic understanding of fusion. But I feel like I've learned a lot through this conversation, and I'm sure many listeners have as well. And grateful that you took the time to share about your experience and the incredible work that Avalanche is up to. So thank you.
Thanks, Karin. You did great, and I love the questions, and thank you so much for having me on. And if anyone ever wants to get in touch, I'm more than happy to always talk fusion.
Very nice.
So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.